Amen. Seeing something old from a new perspective. Well, the scripture today tells us of Jesus' first public act. And what is so important about this reading is what it reveals to us about who Christ is. Now, he's in his hometown where he grew up. The people he's speaking to, watch him grow up from a toddler, probably get into trouble with the other boys in the village. They saw him learn in the synagogue at the feet of the priests and rabbis. They watched him learn his father's trade and support his mother after Joseph's death. And he became a deep-thinking, contemplative person, but not a rabbi and not a priest. Yet here he is reading the scriptures in the synagogue. Indeed, his hometown is seeing Jesus from a new perspective. And Jesus sees his home community from a different perspective, as they showed anger to him. Was he being brave or foolish? The community of Nazareth certainly had their eyes open. They saw Jesus in a different light. Now, the same thing happened to me, but just in different circumstances. Over the years, I have taken the Myers-Briggs personality test several times, and each time the test came out the same, ENFP. So E stands for extrovert, N stands for intuitive, F stands for feeling, P stands for perceptive. And you can see some of the descriptors there in the picture about what that personality type is like. And a side note, my colleagues here maybe have heard this. 25% of the whole population is NFP, but 75% of ministers are NFP. As I look at that, I'm sure that's how people experience me over the years. But in the most recent test, which I only took a week ago, it shows that I am now INFP. Now, only the first letter of the personality type has changed. My personality is now reading as introvert rather than extrovert. Some of the descriptors are the same, but others are different, like reserved, deep, introspective. Some of you may have seen a picture hanging in my office. It was a gift from the Sunday school in Sterling when I left there after I completed my interim. It's a wordle, which is a picture made of words and contains similar phrases that describe me, just as the Myers-Briggs. And as I look back, I can understand the shift. In 2011, I was diagnosed with severe seasonal depression and was off work for 3 months. Counseling and medication and lots of support from family and friends brought me back. But not to my old self, but my new self, one that was reserved, deep, and introspective. And my congregation noted the difference. Now, it wasn't good or it wasn't bad. It was just different. I was seeing life from a different perspective, and my congregation was seeing me from a different perspective. It changed my worship style, my sermons, and my leadership style. These things happen that bring us to see something old from a new perspective. But maybe we need to ask, what does a different perspective mean? How many of you seen the sign that says steep hill? Yep. You understand what it means if you're a driver. Well, I've seen it describe different hills, like this one, which is slow and windy through a village, or this one, which is steep, probably taken in some place like San Francisco. A different perspective. When you sit up in the balcony, you have a different perspective. If those of you up there came and sat down here, you'd be seeing the same old thing, but from a different perspective. If you walk a mile in my shoes, you will have a different or a new perspective. And I believe that is what Jesus was saying to his home community. Here is the old prophecy from Isaiah. It is now alive in me. You are seeing it from a different perspective. Well, I think the same thing applies to being church today. Times change. And these days especially, culture is changing faster than we can keep up with. As a result, the shelf life of ideas, assumptions, and approaches is shorter than it has ever been. What used to work doesn't anymore. The challenge is to know what stopped working and what hasn't. Not everything that worked a decade ago in this church was great, but the truth is many churches grew anyways, like this one. But that's changing, and it will continue to change. What got you here won't necessarily get you there. Now, I want to share with you this morning 9 examples of things that used to work in a ministry a decade ago that aren't nearly as effective as they used to be. Different perspectives on the mission and ministry of the church. The first one is relying on an automatic return to church. It used to be that when young adults went off and got married and then had children, they would return to church. Not necessarily their home church, but maybe where they were living. But those days are gone by. The average unchurched person doesn't think about going to church anymore, any more than the average Christian would think about going to synagogue. It doesn't cross their minds. The second thing is appealing to people out of guilt or obligation. The number of people who feel guilty about not being in church on Sunday morning shrinks daily. Ditto with the number of people at a church who will serve because they feel they should, which is part of the new perspective I'm hoping we can look at announcements not as a work, but as opportunities for engagement in ministry. Interestingly enough, Jesus never appealed to people out of guilt or obligation. He simply invited people. And that, I believe, the future church should as well. 3, simply being better than other churches. When people went to church, being a better church than other churches got you mileage. Most people no longer go to church. Saying we have a better church is kind of like saying we have a better organic, locally grown watercress at a burger cook-off. Most people just aren't going to buy. Better isn't going to get you the mileage that it used to. Gimmicks. So churches used to do lots of things to and still do in places to attract people. Drive a car on stage, build elaborate sets, bring in a Ferris wheel. And all of this did bring people in for a season. But I also came to realize that whatever you use to attract people is what you need to use to keep people. Gimmicks every week get old fast. Instead, maybe we need to move back to more of the basics: the gospel, engaging moments, and engaging messages. We can sustain that. And the basics done really well, with a little extra from time to time, really do engage people. Why? because Jesus, authentically and clearly presented, engages people. 5 is inauthentic leadership. People's fake detectors are set at a much higher level than they used to be. In a culture that markets everything to death, people are longing for authenticity. Fortunately, that's what it is at the heart of the gospel. What has to die, of course, is the leader who acts like he or she has it all together, a plastic veneer we put on hoping nobody sees the real us. None of us has it all together. And while there shouldn't be any gaping, unaddressed character holes in your life, letting people see the real you, even if it scares you a little, is essential. These days, letting people see you're human is a prerequisite for ministry to fellow humans. And that applies to all of us, lay and clergy, staff and volunteers. 6, a self-centered mission no longer works. You have to be careful not to make the mission of your church about your church. When your church has had a little success, it's easy to become self-centered. And I want to use as an example the church I visited in Florida. First Presbyterian Church in North Palm Beach. They have 3 services on Sunday morning, 8:15, 9:30, and 11. Bang, bang, bang. They're full, and they have over 800 out to worship on Sunday mornings. But they're doing, I don't know what they did, but certainly what lots of our churches did 30 years ago. And they're focusing on themselves. Their website has these main links on it. Listen to their sermons on iTunes. New here to First Presbyterian Church, so those who are already in the pews, our preschool, and donate. Not much about the mission of the church. Lots of programs, but it's a church, like many, that relies heavily on the draw of their lead minister. It's pretty self-centered. But the people you're interested in reaching aren't in your church. What they are interested in, whether you realize it or not, is Jesus and his mission. Churches that are obsessed about how big they are, how many programs they offer, and how much better they are than other churches have a limited shelf life. The true mission isn't about your church. It's about the church. That resonates with people. The 7th example is random programming no longer works. The bigger your church, the more you will be tempted to add programs and ministries. Why? Because people demand them. Leaders afraid to disappoint people or lacking an alternative strategy cave and allow dozens of random programs to emerge in their church. But those programs can be counterproductive for a number of reasons. They compete for money, time, and attention. And they may not lead anywhere in particular. They cause more division than unity. Ever try shut down a women's ministry or a men's breakfast? They become their own mission and compete with the overall mission of the church. It's not that they're bad, but the mission needs to be about Jesus' mission. Why does random programming not work? Because random programming pleases insiders, but rarely reaches outsiders. 8 is assuming people know what the next step is. A decade ago, in a more church culture, it was commonplace to assume that most people knew what they needed to do to become a Christian or to grow as a Christian, and that era is gone. Now the average unchurched person arrives knowing almost nothing about Christianity or what to do to become a Christian or how to grow as a Christian. To understand how radically things have shifted, imagine you are going to convert to Hinduism. How many of you know how you would actually become a Hindu? What's your next step? There's the authority. Exactly. Just remember that the next time a completely unchurched person begins to attend your church. 9, relying on what you've learned in the past. I suppose at one time there was a day when seminary adequately trained church leaders for what was ahead. That day has long since passed. Now the basics, biblical knowledge, theology, and the likes don't change dramatically, and they shouldn't. The foundation is reliable years, even decades later. But there is and has been for a long time a growing gap between what leaders need to know about the culture and what they actually know. I daily read half a dozen new articles to keep on new insights into ministry, mission, and leadership. Some seminaries are catching up, but with change happening faster than ever, every leader needs to become a self-learner. And I emphasize again, that's clergy and lay, staff, and volunteers. Sometimes all it takes is a tiny shift of perspective to see something familiar in a totally new light. Jesus read from the prophet Isaiah and said, "This is now alive in me." He invited his congregation and us to have our eyes open to see something old from a new perspective. Amen. Please pray with me. Creator God, your creation changes faster than we can keep up with. Help us to understand what the basics of faith are all about and to offer them outside our doors to those who are seeking